Hello again and very welcome to the chapter about defensive pawn breaks. This is actually the only topic in this course that I hadn't seen somewhere else. You could say I made it up myself, but obviously it's based on things that I had seen in games. It's just that I didn't find it described somewhere in chess literature and so on. What I'm referring to here with defensive pawn break is when we are under an attack and we actually push a pawn in front of our king to help the defense. You would think that this is not good for the defense, it will affect king safety, but it can actually have some advantages, such as clearing space for defensive purposes, clearing the second rank for the rooks or the queen and so on. So let's have a look at what this idea is about. I think that with my first example, you will get a much clearer picture of this idea. We have in this game with the white pieces Volkov, and playing black is Baghdasaryan. Some kind of reversed French, you can see that from the pawn structure. Black has the pawns here on d5 and e4, and white has the e3 and d4 pawns. I think this came up in a Slav variation where black gave up the b pawn. That's why we got this kind of interesting reversed French. You can see that black is a pawn down, they gave away the b pawn, the queen, white queen went to take that pawn on b7, it came back again. So basically, black is playing for an attack here thanks to their strong command of the center. Their last move in this game was queen c8, and it's easy to see what they have in mind. Of course, they are about to sacrifice on h3. So we could, of course, try to mobilize their pieces to the defense. You could play something like, you would consider something like rook e1 to bring the knight to f1 and so on. But in this case, after bishop takes h3, pawn takes h3, queen takes h3, you can see that this is very dangerous. Even if you can play knight f1 here, you would avoid mate e1, but the kind of position that we have here is very menacing for white, because I would basically say that the pawn on e4 is very strong. Whenever you have a pawn like that on e4, it helps to attack really a lot. You can see, for example, there is not bishop f3, bishop g2, and so on. So what black would probably try to do here, they would try to bring a rook to the battle. Probably the best choice would be with this rook, because the other rook it could go there, but it's busy doing other things. It's helping the knight to come to b3 perhaps. Here what black is about to do is rook e6 and then put the knight somewhere and bring the rook to g6. This could be very dangerous for white. I don't think really they can survive this position. You can also consider some long-term plan like bringing the other knight by knight c6, e7, g6, h4 and so on. Difficult situation. Again, I'm really convinced about this. The pawn on e4 is so annoying for white. It boosts any attack for black, you could say. So this is not what we should do. Instead, we can resort to the defensive pawn break. Here you have it. Aha, maybe you know it with a different name, a breakthrough or something. It's also very typical in the French in any case. So that's exactly what we're talking about, f3. Opening up the f file, you can see there are several benefits of this move. One, we open up the f file for counterplay, which is typical in the French as such. And also you can see two, we clear a space on f2, which can be used by this rook so that it's protecting the second rank, which can be very, very important if black continues with their sacrifice. So that's what I refer to with a defensive pawn break. Please notice that you can carry out this idea in two versions. You can go one step with a pawn, or you can go two steps with a pawn. Sometimes one of them will be preferable, and sometimes the other one will be preferable, and sometimes it will be the same thing. Trying to establish some kind of rule about this, I would say that we should only go two steps when we are convinced that their best reply, the opponent's best reply, is to take the pawn. If you consider that they could have something better here, you should of course just go one step. And in effect, if we go two steps in this case, black, instead of taking en passant, they could actually play here something like king h8 and play later on rook g8 and g5. Interesting. And actually in this way, they would have greater chances of an attack because they have their pieces well placed for that purpose. They have many pieces, and they can also, later on, like we were discussing, they can also bring in the other rook to the other side. Somehow white is a little cramped here. It's easier for black to mobilize the pieces to the king side than for white because of their space disadvantage. These pieces are a little squeezed in, you could say. So this would actually favor black, and for that reason, it's better to go one step. It's more committing, you could say. It forces black to do something about the pawn tension. So that's what Sergei Volkov played, by the way, an expert on the French, so it's not surprising that he knew his way here with white pieces also. Now if black takes on h3, that's the immediate benefit we have of this pawn break. We would take back, and after queen takes, we would simply play here the move rook f2. As you can see, This is a perfect arrangement for white because now mate is prevented, and at the same time we can bring in either the bishop or the knight, or perhaps even the queen to the defense, right? Where queen could also go there, depending on black's play. So this would not be really correct for black to sacrifice like that. So in the game, after the move f3, Bagdasaryan instead just took on f3. And here we have an interesting choice French players know about this, how to take back on f3. Yeah, we can't really take with the pawn because the pawn on h3 is hanging, right? But all the other captures are available. In this particular structure, since knight b3 is a resource for black, we should probably not take with the knight. We could take with the bishop, but I think even more powerful is to take with the rook. And that's what Volkov played. And there is a concrete idea behind this move. You got it. We actually have this move coming up. Rook takes f6, pawn takes, and knight takes d5. It's something that white should consider here, typical French idea with reverse colors, rook takes f3 in some lines of the French Taras, for example. So that's what happened in the game. Black played at this point queen c6. That's a very clever move because they knew what was coming up. They knew that this was in the air, and they have something prepared here. They would like to, for example, move the bishop, which would mean that they could protect the f6 pawn if white takes on f6. And indeed, white actually took on f6, I was going to say, but they didn't take on f6. That's my variation. In the game, they played, I think, bishop d3. That's how the game went, and black played bishop c7. That was their idea. Actually, this move, queen c6, it's a nice takeaway. It's a very good move in this example. A nice takeaway from this example because we can bring the queen to d6. What happened in the game? They played queen e2. Maybe Volkov had prepared e4 and then he noticed this move, which is a little annoying. Queen b6 targeting the pawn on d4. So in the game he played after bishop c7, he played queen e2, I think. And black played rook fe8. And they had some pressure here in this position. It's now more difficult for us to bring about e4, and we don't really want to sack when they can take with a queen, I think. So it was actually possible to sacrifice straight away. Rook takes f6 like this. And after d takes f6, we could hurry to play here e4. It's true that black has the same move with queen b6, but as you can see in this case, since we didn't commit with bishop d3, we can now simply safeguard this pawn by means of knight f3. Yeah, if they don't play like that, just for the record, no, if they take on e4, that's dangerous. D takes, knight takes. This is a dream position for white. They will have a very nice attack here, as you can see. The bishop would come to h6. Maybe we can bring the queen to f1 to target this pawn, or we can put it on d3 to play rook f1 and so on. Many ideas come up here in this position. A lot of activity for white, and even a passed pawn on the d file. So e4, queen b6 would be a better choice, but after knight f3, white still keeps things under control. D takes e4, knight takes e4. I think it's slightly more pleasant to play white here, but black is probably not without chances either. In any case, if we go back to the initial position, you can clearly see that it's a favorable outcome, because here definitely black is playing for an attack. It's dangerous to play such positions with white. Yeah, if you remember by chance the game that we saw in the Brave King chapter, the last example, where the black piece is David, Bauer David. If you remember, black did something like king e8 to d7, and they brought the king that way. They wanted to avoid exactly this pattern, where this kind of position scenario where they're under an attack on the king side because the king is committed to g1. It would be that kind of situation, although in that other example I think black's queen would be around g5, but never mind, you get the picture here that somehow black has nice attacking chances here. So I would say this is the only really good chance in this case to break up the f file, to play f3. It's true that it's weakening a little, but more important, the fact that it clears some space for defensive purposes. Specifically, we're ready to play rook f2 at any occasion and take control of the h2 square. And you could also see that we had a choice between f3 and f4. We will come back to that later in this chapter. Here I'm convinced that f3 was the best, but on other occasion you could play f4, and it would even be some kind of psychological challenge for your opponent, because should they take en passant or should they leave it? Well, here they have less of a choice. Also in this case it's a little tricky, because if they don't take, you could imagine that white could play f4, although it's not true. In this case white would definitely take on e4 if they get a chance to open up the f file for the rook. So never mind. Important thing here is to understand that we can actually play f3. We weaken our king a little, but we also help our defensive task because we have more space to operate on, you could say. Let's check our next example. This was some kind of Slav, and here we have, I think it's Queen's Gambit or maybe Ragozin, something like that, with white pieces Dzagnidze, and playing black is Stefanova. You can see that black is playing for an attack. That's not difficult to notice. They have many pieces already in the battle, specifically the rook on h6 is very strong. What basically black would like to do here, they would like to play h4, but perhaps not now, or maybe yes, but probably not, because g4 could come. So maybe first they will play g4 and then they will go h4, trying to break up the h file. And as you can see, the bishop on f8 is ready to join the attack from d6. So very critical situation for white. Not easy to see how to defend here. What Dzagnidze noticed that this was a good occasion for a defensive pawn break, so she hurried to play here the move f3. Again, on this occasion, I think it's best to go one step. If we go two steps, black, they don't really have to take at this point. They could start with this move. It's more powerful, bishop d6, so that they can go h4 next turn and really break up white's defenses on the dark square. So f3 is nicer because it adds some extra pressure to the position. It's now something like f takes e4 and rook f1. That's what white would like to do here. So let's see what happened in the game. Black played bishop d6. I think this is the best move. If they take on f3, on this occasion I wouldn't take with the pawn. I would prefer to take with the knight, because that knight was very passive, and I would like to bring this knight to e5. This would be white's key idea here. For example, if bishop d6, we could give up a pawn temporarily with rook f1, and if they take bishop takes d3, exactly, we will play here knight e5. Activity is everything here. We have to avoid getting killed on the king side. This is the way to create counterplay. You can see that now we have rook takes f5 coming up at some point. Perhaps bishop takes, we could take first, pawn takes, queen takes, and then take on f5, and we have something to play for here. So after f3, instead, after f3, black played bishop d6. There was another variation that I wanted to touch upon very briefly. g4 is an interesting move, because black would still keep their original plan going, trying to open up the h file. So of course, white could now block the position, similar to, if you remember, Giri's move against Artemiev, some kind of pawn blockade. However, it's clear that black could go h4 and continue with their attack. But still, it's not so easy for black to break through. We could play knight f1 here, so that when they take on g3, we take back. But I wanted to ask you something. After h takes d3, knight takes d3. Let's say black plays at this moment queen h4. What do you think? Would you play king f2 to prepare rook h1 perhaps, or would you prefer to defend the knight with a queen? I guess you have to defend it, because else there is a dangerous attack coming up, right? If we let them play something like queen h2 and so on, it's dangerous to take this pawn, I think, because then they could maybe give check here and bring in the rook. Something like this does look a bit worrisome for white. So what do you think? Would you defend it with a king or with a queen? That's a tricky question, you know. Let's see. I will be honest, when I started looking at this, I thought this was the best move. But actually, black has a very nice tactical trick here. If you think in terms of mate, you will find it. Which black piece could help in the mating net? That's right. This bishop. Now you see what's going on here. They would like to take on g3, then they would like to play bishop h4, and in the end, after king h2, they would mate us with bishop f2. And if we try rook h1, they would have a nice reply. They wouldn't take the rook, they would take the knight. Queen takes, king takes, rook takes. And as you can see, there is bishop h4 coming up next. So that would be a big danger for white. Fortunately, if we play instead here queen f2, I think we're safe. We won't move that knight. And later on, we could just sneak away with the king, similar to the brave king idea when we move the king horizontally, so to speak. All right, interesting variation. Let's go back and check the game. Bishop d6 was played, and here Dzagnidze hurried to open up the f file with f takes e4. And after f takes e4, white had e5 coming up, so taking on g3 is not ideal. They just took back here, rook f1, and after queen e7, Dzagnidze hurried to play also the move queen f2. Very natural. Now we have some ideas like queen f5 invading on the light squares. I checked another variation that I wanted to share with you also. Knight a4. We didn't talk so much about the queen side. There wasn't much to do here. But if we come back to the topic of the previous chapter, the defensive sacrifices, you can quickly see that there is an idea with rook takes c6. If black goes back, well, we will also go back because we are under pressure. We're happy to make a draw here. But if they play for a win, let's say they play something like rook b8. This was a bit interesting, this kind of position, because what I was looking at here was rook takes c6. I thought this made sense to like soften up black's defenses. But I checked this with the engine, and the engine told me that after bishop takes queen e6, actually black would be better here. And I think one reason is that black has kept the right bishop on the board. I mean, the right in the sense that it's the better bishop, the dark squared bishop. Well, we will please remember this picture. We will come back to this later. So, for example, white could play knight c5, and then we could just take it, right? Queen takes, and we could continue the attack. I think rook h7 was the best move. Try to trade off rooks. That's usually a good policy when you're exchange up, trade opponent's remaining rook. But please keep this picture in mind, the picture after queen e6. It's interesting to see here that white got some counterplay, but possibly not enough. But it's good to keep this idea in mind. So queen f2 was played in the game, and here there was a mistake from black, unfortunately. What Stefanova wanted to do here, she wanted to avoid any counterplay, and she played bishop g6. But as you can see, this gives white a chance for something else. Aha, you got it. Of course, they control one square, but they lose control of another square. So exactly, queen f6, that's a very nice move, because endgames were great for white, of course. That is something to work on also. We didn't talk so much about that, but you can see that there is a weakness on c6 to work on. So that's how the game went. Queen f6, black had to trade, because in any case, queen e6 is also coming up and the pawn is hanging. Queen takes, rook takes, bishop e7, and at this point, maybe they were planning to take, but as you can see, bishop takes d3. Knight e7 is very powerful because the pawn is falling also on c6. So after bishop e7, white played rook e6, keeping the rook in enemy territory, and you can see that they have quite a lot of counterplay. And I think that in the end, Dzagnidze even won this game. But the critical variation here, if we go back after the move queen f2, black shouldn't have allowed, they shouldn't have prevented queen f5. They should have allowed queen f6. That's what I wanted to say. The most critical move here would have been g4. They could stick to the plan that we talked about in the very first place, try to attack, play h4 at some point, would be dangerous. Also, we have something like, I think, queen c7 coming up next also. So this was an interesting position, and I think what white should do here is they should actually opt for an exchange sacrifice. How could that be done? Well, we retreat the queen this time, having provoked, you could say g4. Right now, I think h4 can be met by knight takes d4. So let's say they play queen c7 to attack that pawn on g3. Now we have the exchange sacrifice. We could actually play like that, rook f4. As you can see, after bishop takes, we take back. And this is now another situation, different situation, because they have the wrong bishop on the board, so to speak. It's not a good bishop. So I think white will have chances here. I remember that the chess engine was not very convinced by that, but I think in a human context, actually white has good chances of saving this game. Maybe we can reroute the knight to e3, for example. Maybe we should consider to go with the king to the other side, if possible, if not running into some troubles. But I think this was a chance for white to keep the battle going, at least. That's what could have happened if black had played in the most precise way. In any case, what I wanted to show you here was that white was under huge pressure. g4, h4, bishop d6. These were the moves that were coming, and Dzagnidze correctly established that the only chance lies in playing f3. So you could say it was a little of everything here. We open up some space for a counter-attack. We create also a flight square for the king on some occasion. It was important to understand that if we open up the f-file, we can actually harm black's position also. They have a space advantage, but it was possible to infiltrate, exploiting their space advantage after bishop d6 and pawn takes, rook f1 and queen f2 and all that. We are able to, at least to try to exploit that space disadvantage that we have. So that happens sometimes. Funnily enough, when you gain space, you also have more space to control on black's task. It's not exactly trivial here, which is also why Stefanova lost her way here at this point. So in any case, f3, very useful method, something to remember, trying to break up the position a little and make our defense simpler. All right, our next example, it's with the black pieces, and it's the same picture again. I should tell you also that in this chapter about the defensive pawn break, we have several different examples, but actually all of them feature the same pawn. For some reason, it's more likely to happen, I think, with the f-pawn. So it's always the f-pawn, and it's always a short castle king that you will see here. But it's actually something that happens rather often, comparatively often in practice. So it's a useful method. So let's see if we understand this game. It's this position. It's Esipenko with the white pieces and Stoyanov playing black. White has just played, I think, queen g4. Aha, what's the point of queen g4? Attack, of course, but is there any concrete threat? Yes, indeed there is. They would like to play bishop h6. Interesting. Not h6 because black would block with g6, but bishop h6 is more tricky because they would focus on this mating idea, and if black plays g6, then they weaken up their king side, and you can see that the h file is open and so on. So what do you think black should play here? Is there any way of making our defensive task a little simpler? Something which doesn't allow them to play bishop h6 perhaps? Aha, you got it. We can go for a defensive pawn break. This time I think we should not go one step, because then the pawn on e6 would be falling. It will actually fall anyway, but this would be a worse version. I'm also not sure if actually we could use the same idea here. Interesting. Maybe they can actually play bishop h6 here also. This would be dangerous for black for sure. So in the game, what Stoyanov did, he went 2 steps instead. So this is a good example of where we should actually go 2 steps. Also, as I told you, when you think that the capture is the best choice for the opponent, usually it makes sense also to play f5. But here, of course, by elimination, we know that we have to play f5. We have to act quickly here. f5, the merit that it's hitting the queen, of course. So what's going on here is that after e takes f6, knight f6, again, we have managed to ease in our task a little. It's true that we lose the pawn on e6, but it doesn't matter so much, because we have other advantages in this position. We were a pawn up actually from the very beginning, and we have a passed pawn on the b file. So this is a very good outcome for black already. And this is exactly how Stoyanov played. So it's not some strange computer variation. It's exactly what occurred in the game. Black played at this point rook e8 to smoke out white's queen. White played here queen f5, and black hurried to use the idea of defensive exchanges. They played here the move queen d7. Very clever. So basically the trade of queens would make black's task a little simpler, and they would later on bet on this passed pawn. That's a very, very important ingredient in this position, the passed pawn on the b file. So white, actually, they can't really progress here in the attack. If they play something like queen g5, what would you play with the black pieces? How could you create activity? Aha, that's right. We could play something like knight e4. And it's interesting that in this case, we're actually able to carry out a defensive exchange. We could take the rook on g3. So bishop takes e4. We could take on g3. They will take back somehow with the queen perhaps, and we could take back on e4. I would take with the pawn so that I keep the last rank control or something like that. So this looks interesting for black. It's probably not worse. So what happened in the game was actually that Esipenko, he shifted his focus a little. He traded queens, queen takes d7, after knight takes d7. He found the key move here. To look at this from white's perspective also, we're a little beyond the topic of the defensive pawn break, but I still thought it was an interesting example. So what do you think white should play here to keep practical chances? Aha, that's right. We should play here the move h6. This is very clever because it puts black into some practical difficulties. Should they take or should they play g6? That's a difficult decision, a tough decision for black. G takes h6 or g6? What do you think? Well, I'll share my theory about this. I think that if you can indeed get away with taking the pawn, you should always take it. Play g6 should be really like the plan B, like if nothing else works, because if you play g6, then you will have this hanging over you for the rest of the game. Not only here, I mean in this position, but in general, it's dangerous to let them have a pawn like that on h6. I think we talked about this in some other example. We saw it, for example, in the chapter about defensive exchanges. If you remember that example where black, I think it was Yufa with the black pieces, he played queen f7 and the queens were traded, and he ended up in a bad endgame. Erigaise Yufa perhaps. In that endgame there was a pawn on a6 and there was a pawn on a7, if you remember, which greatly helped white's task in that rook endgame that occurred in that game. So here it's basically the same thing. This is dangerous long term. It might be a draw with perfect play, but we will always have a little headache due to this powerful pawn on h6. So that's how the game went. Here, Esipenko played bishop e5. He put some more pressure after rook takes g3, bishop takes g3. He later on, after black defended the knight, I think he just went back with the bishop, and then he started invading with the rook. And he actually won this game in the end. Very strong very nice game by Esipenko, very strong effort to win this position. So what I think is that we should always take such pawns if we can get away with it. But of course we have to look at it technically with good calculation to establish whether it's okay or not. And here you can see that white is of course having some kind of mating idea with bishop e5, but it's not so easy for them to bring it about. For example, here, if you play something like rook c1, trying to enter with the rook and chase away that knight, what do you think black should play? You're completely right. We should fight against that plan. Rook c3 is a good move. We're fighting against white's rook, and if they go that way, of course, we can do exactly the same thing. So let's say after g takes h6, white plays bishop b5 instead, trying to take and basically mate us. How will we defend here? Well, we should start with rook e7 so that we can play bishop g7 whenever needed. We will suffer a little here, but the reward comes later when we have organized our pieces and we don't have to worry about that menacing pawn on h6, white's pawn, I mean. So bishop d6, we can just play rook f7, and as you can see, white cannot profit from the tension here, because if bishop takes d7, we will of course take on d6. So rook e7, rook c1, white is trying to enter. This time, since the rooks are touching each other, there is tension, we can't really make this work. They will just take it, so it's better to take on g3, so that after bishop takes, we can finally bring in the king here. King g7, for example. So white, it still appears as if they have an initiative, but it's actually not so simple. If rook c7, for example, we could just put the knight there, so that we don't get checked on this side. So let's say they play something like rook c8 instead. They're having some ideas like bishop d6 perhaps at some point, but we could play here the move knight b6. We're now hitting the rook, so they cannot play, I think, bishop d6 they cannot play, and also they cannot play bishop e5, because then we can actually take it, right? Because we have this tactic in the pocket, and rook check, we will come back. So they will have to play something else here after knight b6, rook b8, for example, and we could play knight c4. As simple as that. We are now avoiding the check on e5 by white's bishop, and obviously if they take, we're very happy to take back. Then they will be in trouble. You can see some tactics also. Rook takes before fails to rook e1 check and so on. But okay, these are tactical details. What I wanted to show you here is that black has actually managed to escape the attack. We had this position in the very beginning. You could see that white was definitely having compensation for the pawn. They had a nice attack coming up here. Bishop h6 was the concrete threat. Stoyanov understood that the defensive pawn break was the best chance on this occasion. He played here f5 correctly. 2 steps to create a threat against white's queen. And after e takes, knight takes, he lost the pawn on e6, queen takes e6, but he had plenty of activity. Rook e8. You can see, for example, what we talked about in the first place, that now the queen is actually very helpful in the defense. That didn't happen when the pawn was on f7. So you could say it's having multiple advantages. Also, the fact that the e5 pawn went away. That's something that I've perhaps forgot to mention, that when we carry out this trade, this trade between these 2 pawns, it also means that white loses part of their space advantage. And when this happens, we also get a square for our knight, right? Which we couldn't use in the first place because the pawn was there. So many advantages connected to this idea of the defensive pawn break. So f5, very nice move, and black had every chance to believe in success in their defensive play. Let's check another example, which is more tactical. This is a really complex one because white actually sacrificed a piece to reach this position. It's with white pieces Sargsyan, and playing black is Hairapetyan. You can see that after white's last move, knight h5, there is a very dangerous attack coming up. Queen g4 is the concrete threat. You can see that there are mating ideas against the g7, but also black is weak on the h file, obviously, since they don't have an h pawn anymore. So safe to say, black will have to be very careful in the game. Unfortunately, they didn't defend in the best way. They played in the game here g6, after which white continued with their intended move, queen g4. You can see bishop takes g6 is in the air now, king h7. And what do you think white played here? Can you think of a powerful attacking move? That's right, we're back in chapter 18 now. We're talking about opening up lines for the attack. f5, killer move. You can see what's going on here. Idea of mate. We're trying to open up the b1, h7 diagonal. And after black's move, e takes f5, white had a neat little reply prepared here. Exactly, very pretty move. Queen f4, but it's going to h6. You can see there is no way for black to defend against the mate here. For example, if you take on f5, I think you just get mated, right? Queen takes and queen h7 or something like that. Or maybe there is some other way to play, but this looks convincing enough. So that's what happened in the game. g6, not a good idea. White played queen g4 with the threat of bishop takes, and also f5 was coming up next. Complete disaster for black. So what should I do? Not so easy at all. Rook e8 is another idea. Try to bring the bishop to the defense, but in that case, white can actually sack in a different way. Knight takes d7. Very clever move, because after king takes, we have queen check, and then f5, I think, again, is very powerful here. Exactly, f5, and we get bishop h6 in. So yeah, what a nightmare for black, this kind of position. So the only way out, as you know by now, we're in the chapter of defensive pawn breaks, so the next move is evident. Aha, we have to go 2 steps. We can't go 1 step, because then again they could look at these 2 ideas, queen g4 or perhaps even knight takes d7. That would be very dangerous, but we should of course go 2 steps in this case, because in this way we are able to prevent queen g4. My theory about why Hajrapetyan didn't play like this is that he didn't like the fact that he will lose the e6 pawn, just like Stoyanov in the previous example. Still, after e takes f6, knight takes, queen takes e6, rook f7, black is still able to put up a fight here, I think. Please notice we should play this move even if it invites bishop g6, because if we play king h8, what do you think white would play? That's right, everybody to the party. White can introduce another piece to the attack. This move is coming up now. It's extremely dangerous. Threats like knight takes f6, mate e1, and so on. So it's much better to keep the king on g8. It's comparatively the safest spot, and black can live with losing the exchange here. Bishop g6, you will think that the rook f8 is the best move here, but actually it's hurting the black king's freedom of movement. White could play something like knight takes, I think, and after something with queen h3, I remember, was very annoying for black. Yeah, if you take with the bishop, for example, queen h3 is bad news for black, and if you take with the pawn, I think it's the same move, right? Queen h3. No, rook e3 perhaps. Okay, rook e3 and then bring over the rook. So this is also bad for black. Somehow it's better to have the bishop here so that we have some extra possibilities, like, for example, queen d7, trying to trade off the queens and so on. So bishop f8, that's a more precise defensive move. Now we have, for example, queen d7 coming up. Yeah, I looked a little at this position. If queen h3, trying to reach the previous variation, something like knight e7, we bring in the knight. This was also not possible with the bishop on e7. So that makes perfect sense, trying to challenge white's bishop. If they take, we take back, and relatively safer than the other variations that we saw recently. So after bishop f8, white could take on f6, with the point that after d takes f6, they could play d5. Yeah, this is not so obvious, but what white is trying to do, they're trying to close the game a little. They don't want black to take on d4 with counterplay, so they will play d5. We will have to put the knight somewhere. There are not so many squares, so maybe to d8. Queen f5, this still looks very ugly. It's a typical computer variation where the computer closes the game for our counterplay and then it wants to attack itself. So you have to be very precise here. Queen d7, trying to trade the queens. Queen h5, and another typical computer move, you would say rook h7, funny move, but time is money. We have to act quickly here before they get the rook into the battle. So rook h7 is a good move, and it seems that at this point, since there is also tension, the pawn on d5 is sometimes hanging. White should probably go for the endgame here. Bishop takes, queen takes, queen takes, king takes, c4, cementing the pawn structure, and we will have to play something like knight f7. I remember that the computer still likes white here. It prefers greatly white, but I think that black is not without chances. After all, it's just a slight material disadvantage. We could try to somehow cook up some counterplay. At least, meanwhile, we're facing a human opponent. I think we have chances of saving this game. And there are also ideas like f5 and maybe bishop g7 and activating the pieces. So I think many things could happen here in this endgame. So anyway, that's not even relevant because our mission here was to save our skin. And if we end up in a worse endgame, well, that's the best it gets, right? We have to avoid mate in the first place. So for that reason, f5 is a very good option here. We prevent queen g4 in the first place, and we also clear some space for our defense, and we don't care so much about losing this pawn on e6. We have to live with that. So very important to play the defensive pawn break on this occasion. All right, let's look at something somewhat less crowded. Our next example, it's a French middle game. You can see that white this time sacrificed a pawn. They have more activity than us, that cannot be denied. Other pieces are fairly active, and if you look carefully, you can spot a concrete threat here. There is a concrete threat that white is playing for. So if it's white to move, what do you think white would like to do? Good point. Aha, we can bring in the knight. Knight e4, exploiting the pin along the d-file. This means that the knight would come very quickly to f6, and that's easy to understand. The rest, right? Pawn takes, and mating patterns coming up. So black should avoid this in some way. What they played in the game was very nice. By now you know, of course, which is the piece involved in this action. Aha, we should use the f-pawn. I think both are okay, both f6 and f5 are okay. Difference perhaps if f5 we don't really fight against white center. Instead of taking, perhaps they could consider something like knight e2 and trying to reroute the knight to some other square. So in the game, by the way, in this game with the white pieces, Bernatsky playing black is Song. Song played f6, the pawn break in action. We are clearing some space for defensive purposes, and also we are fighting against white's center. White continued with the same plan, knight e4. And at this point, I wanted to single out also that if they play something like, which was my variation here, knight e2. If they play something like knight e2, sticking to this plan of rerouting, it's not the same thing with the pawn on f6. We could take on e5, and after queen takes, we could play this move rook b7. Very clever, saving the rook and safeguarding the 7th rank. So that's what could have happened in this variation. I looked further here, rook takes, queen takes, knight d4. What would you play with the black pieces here? How could you fight against white's central dominance? Exactly, queen f6. Very good move. You're trying to open up the game a little, try to push e5. Please notice that something like rook e1 would not make sense here. Black would take. This is what every French player knows. King f7 followed by king f6. Ultimately, we will actually challenge their blockade. They will not have compensation for that minus pawn. They would prefer to have a pawn on f4, for example. So, nice move. f6, opening up the game in front of our king, but that's the only way we can really cope with white's plan. Let's see what happened in the game. They played knight e4. They stick to this plan, but now it's different, of course, because they cannot just settle on f6 like that. So here, black found a very nice move. Please notice that we cannot just routinely put the queen on e7, because in that case there is pawn takes, and white picks up the exchange here. Aha, exactly, queen g3, there's hanging rook on b8. So that explains black's best move here. They played a move which does several things at the same time. It unpins the pawn on d5, it protects the rook on b8, and also it offers the trade of queens, which would help black quite a lot. So of course, you know which move I'm talking about, queen b6, exactly. In this way we keep the rook protected, so we are actually ready to take at some point on e5. If queen g3, that's not a correct sacrifice, we could take on e4, but it's important to see that after e takes f6, there is a very precise move that we have to play. Exactly, you got it, rook b7, and here you can see very nicely how black benefits from this defensive pawn break, because now they can use the 7th rank without any big difficulties, no obstacles there anymore. So queen b6, in the game white played here knight c5, and black used this move again. It's a funny move, but yeah, I must say, this is a really impressive game by black. They didn't fall into the temptation of taking, of course. This would be very dangerous, because please don't forget that they have this rook outside of the defensive battle. White would take on f8 and bring the other rook to f1 quickly. Rook takes, king takes, rook f1, and later on take back the pawn. This would be disastrous for black, because their pieces are not participating in the defense. So you would say that, all right, I understand, they want to take and play queen g3. So what if I play something like rook f7? Well, in this case, you can see that if pawn takes, white could actually refrain from this check, and they could bring in the rook instead and try to use the rook in the attack. So if you look at this position, you will notice the problem for black. Aha, they are playing without this rook, and that explains the best move, which was also played in the game here. Black played a neat little move, rook b7, because they know that they can profit from this pin. The white knight cannot move due to the tension between the queens. So very good move. Rook b7, quickly bringing the rook to the defense. You can see that the bishop can simply stay on c8. It doesn't need to develop anymore. It will just stay there and take control of this pawn. So let's see what happened in the game. E takes f6, and black played here the move rook bf7 to take back in a smarter way on f6. Not easy anymore for white to get anything here in this endgame. Sorry, in this middle game. Black is very well organized. You can see that now all the pieces are participating in the defense. After b4, yeah, white had a problem with his knight, so they wanted to secure it. b4, c takes b3 to win a tempo, c takes, and then rook takes f6. Black was a pawn up, and you can see that there is not a trace of a white attack anymore. Black's having a much better position here. You can think of a plan like, for example, queen d6, trying to push e5. So nice play here by Song in this example. He knew that there were some dangers on the king side. Knight e4 was a dangerous threat, but by playing this move f6, a little, you could say, paradoxical at first sight. Why open up the game in front of our king? But actually it's having more benefits than difficulties, this move, because it helps us to bring in the rook to the defense, and it fight against white's center, and it also opens up the f-file for counterplay. All right, I think it's time to look at a Sicilian example, because also in the Sicilian structure we can come across this idea. In this very, very nice attacking game or counter-attacking game between with the white pieces Pipers and playing black Fier, Brazilian Grandmaster, we have something that will definitely teach us a lot. This example, white was playing for an attack. You can see that f5 is the immediate threat, followed by bishop h6. Black could try to fight against this plan in different ways, but what Fier did, I think, is the most practical approach. He played here our favorite idea, of course, f5. He went for the defensive pawn break. Yeah, it looks like a French, but it's actually Sicilian, because it happened at some point that white, I think black played d5, a pawn break, and white replied with e5, and that's how they ended up like that. In any case, f5, a very good move here. Yeah, 2 steps is probably recommendable. In any case, white will probably take, but yeah, in this case, if they do something else, yeah, we have like free hands. We don't have to think about the tension. If we play like f6, we don't think about the tension between the pawns and so on. So f5 at once, I think it's smarter in any case. In such kind of position, white should usually try to open up the game. So that's what they did here with e takes f6. It's interesting that if they had played instead the move queen h3, I looked at this also with the idea of playing g4. This was another idea that they could have considered. Interestingly, if they do that, we could actually enter something which is similar to the game between Robson and Wolf. If you remember that example, perhaps in the chapter about mobilization to the defense, maybe you remember that black had a very nice bishop maneuver in that game. That could happen here. Black could play here bishop d7, and after g4 they could play knight c6. Black's point here is that they will ultimately bring the bishop to the defense in this way, or to the attack, call it what you like. So for example, g takes f5, knight takes d4, bishop takes, rook takes. They could actually later possibly consider this plan of planting a bishop on g6, where it will obstruct white's attack along the g-file. So that could happen if white decides not to take on f6. But in the game, after f5, they indeed played e takes f6. After bishop takes, knight f3, you can see that white's about to play bishop d4, fighting against black's strong bishop. Black played here knight c4, and here white had a bad moment. They should have played here bishop d4 to trade off that important bishop, and we would have a complex battle. Maybe bishop takes, knight takes, and queen b6 later on, trying to get on with the attack. But in the game, unfortunately, Pipers, he went for a little pawn here. He played bishop c5, forking the rook and the pawn. But the problem with this is that it will just help black's attack. So now, please look how Fier continued fantastic counterattack. He starts with queen a5. All right, so this is evident that he's attacking a2, but please notice that also b2 is a threat, because there is a liability. The knight is protecting the bishop. So yeah, white has to protect the pawn in the first place. They have to play here king b1. Now Fier continues with the plan, knight takes b2, and nobody cares about losing the exchange. Bishop takes f8, and at this point, yeah, you could see that if they take back, of course, we take their bishop, right? So bishop takes f8, and what do you think black played next? Did I take on d3, or is there something stronger? Of course, this is a Sicilian where everything is allowed. Knight a4, we go for an attack. You can see knight c3 is coming, some idea with knight e2 perhaps if the king goes that way. So definitely white is under pressure. They played here bishop takes before, and they could have played here black rook b8. It was possible, but what Fier played was very nice also, knight c3. By the way, at this point we could say that the defensive task is done. Our king is very safe on g8, but it's interesting to see how this attacking battle continued. So let's have a quick look. It's a very nice attacking game. So if bishop takes, we should take with the bishop so that we keep the plan of attacking on the b file. It was tempting to take with the knight, with the queen, of course, but in that case, I think white had some counter resource here. Knight fe5, exactly, blocking the bishop. So it's smarter to take with the bishop so that it cannot be blocked anymore. So after knight c3 check, white played king c1. Here it was interesting to take like that, take on a2 and take on b4, but Fier played queen takes a2. Now you can see that there is mate in there. Black would like to retreat this knight and then threaten queen a1. Yeah, by the way, you're saying what happened with knight e2 then, but I guess if knight e2, king d2, we have also the black queen hanging there, so it's better to play like he played, queen takes a2. So after rook h e1, safeguarding the e2 square, black played at this point the move a5. Yeah, this check can wait. There was some tactical turbulence here. Maybe they can even take on e4 in that case because black's queen is hanging. So he played a5. Very beautiful move because he has noticed that bishop takes. He's a rook down, but he's mating. So white cannot really take on c3. They played bishop d6, and here black continues in very beautiful fashion. Knight e4 so that the king won't escape. And after rook takes e4, what do you think black played? Exactly, very, very beautiful. Bishop c3. They're one rook and one piece down, but they are weaving a mating net here. It's almost impossible for white to escape. Now they have to give up a lot of material they played in the game. Knight e2, time to cash in, d takes e4. Knight b3, yeah, they couldn't take, of course, because then there is mate again. So knight b3, we take another piece, he takes d3, rook takes d3. Now material is about equal, but black's attack is, white has no attack really. Black's attack is very strong, I was going to say. Bishop e2 check, king d2, and bishop a6. At last, the bishop joins the battle. You can see that rook d8 is also coming. Very difficult for white to save this game. They played rook e3, and after rook d8, rook takes e6. It's not difficult to see black's next move here, of course. We're looking at concrete threats. Bishop c4, trying to kick away the rook from the defense of the bishop. After queen e3, white is trying some last tricks here, but they don't really work. After bishop takes, queen takes, king h8 for the first time in the game. Black is ahead in material, and it's too much already. Queen e7, bishop f6, queen c7, and in the end, a4. White resigned because next turn I think the bishop is going to fall. So fantastic attacking game by Fier, but it was first, you could say, a defensive situation. He had to figure out how to stop the plan of f5 and bishop h6, or maybe rook f1 also could be included. He did this by means of f5. It was a very powerful idea. After e takes f6, bishop takes f6. It's true that he weakened his dark squares a little, but this also helped to a great deal his defensive play, this move f5. In our last example, I wanted to show you that we can also use this idea in another pawn structure. It doesn't have to be always a pawn on e5. In our last example, we have actually a pawn on g5 instead. This is an Italian battle with white pieces Maria Muzichuk and playing black is Kostenjuk. White has just pushed, I think, g5. The problem with this for white is that also their king is a little exposed, and black has many pieces on the king side, which means that they can start a counterattack. So what Kostenjuk did, by the way, a great attacking player, Alexandra Kostenjuk, she didn't spend time on taking the pawn or defensive measures. By the way, she takes, I think white takes with a knight, and this is what Muzichuk was aiming at, hopefully take and open up the light squares with d4 and so on. So she didn't want to cooperate in this way. Kostenjuk, she went for a defensive pawn break instead. So now you know which move I'm talking about, of course. f5, 2 steps please, because if you go 1 step, you can see that this would let white play g6 and bishop g8, knight f5. We shouldn't allow that, of course. We will even be scared about something like bishop takes h6 and g7 coming up next. So 2 steps, of course. It's an attacking situation, and we don't really count the pawns. We give up a pawn here because we have a nice attack coming up. G takes h6, that's what white played in the game. That was not a good idea. Now the g file is cleared for black's attack. It was better to play something safe here. What would be the safest choice? I think d4 was the best move. g6 is not so convincing, bishop g8, and we can just come back with the bishop, and black can continue playing for an attack later on. But we could have played something like d4, I think, pawn break, and after e4, knight h4, at least trying to cook up something to make the game a little more confusing. This would have been better, although knight e7 is a good reply, preventing the invasion on g6. In any case, after d takes h6, Alexander Kosteniuk simply took back on h6, and after bishop takes h6, rook g8. White's now a pawn up, but you can just look at their king. There is f4 coming up, the queen can come to f6, even some ideas like e4 and bishop takes g3 and so on, many things coming up next here. Bishop b3 was played in the game, queen f6, we bring in the pieces. By the way, the rook was hanging, yeah, I forgot to say that, yeah, after bishop b3, white is actually attacking the rook, but black knows the logic of this game, of course. We're playing for an attack. I mean, the logic of the attacking game, I'm saying here, that attack and defense. White's having a rook which is not participating. If we can play queen f6 and we can bring in the other rook like that, we are having an advantage in relative activity, you could say. We are more active than the opponent, even if they have a material advantage. Yeah, we talked about this in the chapter 19 about sacrifices in the defense. White played bishop g5. That cannot be correct, but okay, it was difficult to save them. The bishop was in the air, and also f4 is coming up next. So yeah, it's not the ideal way to defend, of course, here, because the two pieces are much more valuable than the rook. Rook takes, knight takes, queen takes, a funny material relation, 3 minor pieces versus 2 rooks, but in this kind of attack-defense situation, definitely it's better to have the minor pieces. In the endgame, perhaps the other team, the 2 rooks, would be stronger. King f1 was played in the game, knight f6, we're bringing more pieces to the attack. White played here queen f3, and after knight g4, there were new threats for white to consider here. They played queen g2, and Kosteniuk didn't think twice about her next move here, e4, very strong move, clearing more space for the attack. You can see that they don't want to play f4, of course, because then white could play knight e4. So this is a trick that is well known from the Benoni, for example. You go e4 first, and if they take, only then we go f4, like an anti-blockade sacrifice, so they cannot put the knight there. So very nice move, e4, white played in the game d4, and I wanted to ask you about the last move that I have included here. The game continued, but I was going to stop here because the last move is very nice also. So what do you think black played? In which way could they make their attack even stronger? Aha, that's right. We can actually bring our last piece to the party. That's what Kosteniuk played, knight d8. Very pretty move. The knight is coming forward in this way, and it will be very difficult for white to defend this position despite perhaps having a slight material advantage. But we don't really count the pawns or anything here. We can simply see that white's king is doomed here in the long run. Black is simply too active in this position. If they play something like d5, we can perhaps reroute the knight to some other destiny. It's simply a very nice position for the minor pieces here. They have so many squares and so many possibilities. White's rooks, they don't have open files and so on to work on. So nice display here by Alexandra Kosteniuk. She noticed that g5, there was no reason to take on g5 to avoid the loss of a pawn. She was interested in attacking herself, so she played here the move f5. Perhaps a little different to our other examples here in the defensive pawn break, but still they had something in common, the fact that we will open up files a little for defensive purposes, but especially for attacking purposes, because after g takes h6, the pawn takes, the g file opened up for black. So this was definitely a good choice here by black. So let's have a look at what we have checked here in this short chapter. We started with the French example, you would say like the reversed French. White saw that bishop takes h3 was coming up, so they quickly played f3 to clear some space in front of the king and mobilized the rook to the defense. In our next example, Dzagnidze did something similar, f3, and prepared to attack even on the f-file, create counterplay on the f-file. And you saw some variation where they played, what did they play? They took, and you could take with a knight and put a knight on e5. That's another nice idea that you could consider, not to quickly bring the knight. We're happy that this pawn on e4 leaves the board. That was one of the ideas behind these defensive pawn breaks, to eliminate that pawn which sometimes like suffocates us. In the next example, we saw that Stoyanov hurried to play f5 here because there were dangers on the king side, and he didn't care about losing the pawn on e6. This was a very appropriate decision, and it helped black to defend in a better way, clearing the 7th rank for the queen and so on. We saw in this very complex attacking example that it was the only chance, definitely the only chance for black was the defensive pawn break. They badly needed to clear some space in front of the king, making it possible again to bring in the knight and bring in the rook and so on. There were several benefits from this move had they opted for this move f5, which was not so obvious here because also the e6 pawn dropped off. We saw in the example Bernatsky's song that black correctly played f6 before white was able to bring a knight to that square, and we saw that they could later on bring the rook along the 7th rank to the defense. This worked perfectly, you could say, this defensive pawn break in this game. We saw Fier's fantastic attacking effort, but it all started actually with a defensive pawn break. He didn't like the idea of white playing f5. He stopped it by playing f5 himself, and after pawn takes, bishop takes, it helps his attack much more than it helps white's attack, so to speak. It was very favorable for black, this kind of change in the pawn structure. And finally, we saw how Kostyaniuk hurried to play f5 here, sacking a pawn in exchange for counterplay and holding down white's attack, or eliminating white's attack, you could say. After this move f5, I would say it was basically play against one goal. All right, thanks, and see you in the next chapter.